Hello, good morning, and very warm welcome from my side. Welcome to the session on mastering interdependent cross-team ecosystems using multi-stage Kanban on pretty large scale. First of all, some words of introduction to myself so you can get an idea of who is presenting to you. My name is Boris Kneisel. I'm stemming from Germany. I used to work for about 20 years in a very large software industry player. And since 2018, I made myself a complete independent innovation coach on scaling agility. You will find all my contact data in the slides for later reference in case you have questions that we may not be able to cover time-wise during the questions and answer session. Please just feel free to drop me an email, as you can see here, or just give me a call on the mobile phone number attached. This slide basically just gives you an indication of what kind of industries and what kind of companies the methodology that I'm going to be using and going to present to you in the next 40 minutes has successfully been leveraged on. Basically, it is a broad coverage of large industry players, software, hardware, and services, and also some small medium enterprises. So this basically allows us to understand that the methodology shown in this presentation is very broadly applicable across industry verticals and across company sizes. It basically feels like a Swiss Army knife with respect to its company fit. Now let's enter into the topic. First of all, we should try to understand why mastering ecosystems requires us to understand how to describe an organization. There exist a couple of organizational descriptions and models, and they have some kind of long history dating back in the respective publishings. So I have just grabbed one very famous example, which we will see in the coming slide. This is a very classic description of an organization. It has been described by Michael Porter, who used to be a strategy professor at Harvard, and it is called the value chain. So I'm not going to go too much into the details of the Porter value chain model because I assume that most of you guys have come across it and have seen it already, or at least know by now that they can actually just Google for the keywords and then they will find tons of information sitting on the internet free of charge. Basically, what I would like to point out to is that, as given here in the second line on the header, a Porter value chain model represents a rather strategic level of an organization. It basically means we have something that I would like to call rather a satellite view. It is not so easy to operationalize on a satellite view when it comes to what to do with a team. However, when we want to implement something like Kanban to ensure continuous small steps of improvement, we need to actually do exactly this. We need to boil it down and operationalize it. That's why the next slide gives us an indication where to actually start over. Now, if we want to extend Porter's value chain model, we first of all should try to create a visual operating model of the organization. And this actually needs to show the relations between connected nodes within the organization. A node might represent a team, it might represent a department, or any kind of other means that is a sub-organizational entity. So basically, what I have tried to model out in this view for you is a kind of ground view on the organization, because this starts to reveal communication paths and information flows. I would like to point out that already on this slide that just leverages the Porter value chain model that we have seen before, we see two sort of basically a bit decoupled information flows. First of all, we have here a development function that resonates with research and development and is basically the later bit time-wise. Research very often is very strategic, very early in a process. Development actually gets things more down to become a tangible product or service. Now, the development function already has influences from at least 4 other domains or departments or teams, as you like it. First of all, there is the marketing and sales department. So a unit that represents the outside-in perspective to the organization. Typically, marketing and sales staff is pretty close to the market, pretty close to customers actually. So it basically means that they are feeding an outside-in information flow into the organization, here modeled via an arrow to the development function. A second stream of information, a second flow, stems from the service and support function. Also, they have an interconnection and an input to the development. That could mean that they are reporting bugs that have been delivered from a software team to the market and have not been caught before through intensive testing also. And then we have another two streams that, just to make sure that we understand how complex this may get, represent the technology perspective. So the technology and infrastructure have a link, which I just have made in dashes here to the development, and also the strategy group will have a link to the software development or the hardware development function. Now, a kind of sort of slightly decoupled second model is the one that we see here, which is in a kind of yellow flooded cell in background to ensure we understand better that this is a bit separate, because the yellow big flooded box represents the primary supply chain of the organization, typically a bit decoupled from developments to ensure that the supply chain is running smooth on an established model of the business. So part of the organization takes care of running the business, that's the supply chain in yellow background. Part of the organization develops new stuff, new products and services, that's the part including the development function. Now you see inside the logistics supply chain, we have an information flow that ranges from inbound logistics, or purchasing and procurement, if you will, into the production. And from production, it moves on into outbound logistics. That's the distribution and delivery functions of the organization. Now, having understood that the need to break down a Porter value chain from strategic to operational level helps us in identifying the ground view and the communication paths, brings us to the next step. Once we have successfully described the relationship between departments or teams inside an organization, the same actually applies also across multiple organizations. What you see on the upper part of the slide here is just a set of 3 Porter value chains in a row, in a linear fashion as I have arranged them for you. Now, each of those Porter value chain models represents one company. This could be a first-tier supplier in automotive, for instance. This could be an automotive OEM, a totally different separate company. And the third one could be a wholesaler or another distributor kind of company within the overall ecosystem. Each of them running inbound logistics, production or transformation, if you would like to call it that way, and delivery and distribution functions. And then they actually are spanning across into the inbound of the following company that is following downstream. And the same is true between the Porter value chain number 2 and number 3. What I have modeled out here in brown is also a kind of idea to show that information flows may also go backwards. So the information is not just a single one-way street. It is actually a back and forth. And we know that if something like this is modeled in a bad way, it results in what we call a bullwhip effect. If you want to read further about bullwhip effect, I can highlight out an article that stems from 1997 of Professor Hao Li at, I guess it was Stanford University, if I remember correctly, that has been published in the literature and is pretty famous. It's about developing the bullwhip effect in supply chains, or modeling the bullwhip effect in supply chains, if I remember correctly. You will find that on the internet if you Google for the key terms. And Hao Li is the name of the person who is one of the authors. Now, what I would like to point out in the lower section of this slide, after we have understood that the Porter value chain models of different companies interconnect is to draw your attention to the fact that the connection not necessarily needs to be linear. In the upper part, it looks like as if the connection always is a linear chain. That's why the term supply chain had been coined. However, in reality, very often they just form a multidimensional network, which is indicated in the lower part of the slide here. And just to make us aware fully, the whole thing applies across the whole planet. So the surface of planet Earth is actually consisting of lots of nodes that are forming a network of intertwined supply chains that intersect with each other, and that's why they actually represent a quite two-dimensional and pretty complex model. Now, once we have understood this sort of background theory, it is now time for us to enter into what we can actually do with it using Kanban. Now, the next section of the presentation is about if we assume an organization is represented as a network of nodes, as we have learned in the first part, then a question arises, what are the design elements that describe what happens between the nodes? Because the node itself is just a static kind of entity. The interesting stuff on the business is the transactions, and they basically mean that we need to model out stuff that happens between two or multiple nodes. So the nodes and the connectors between the nodes are now getting into our focus. Which brings us to the next slide, where for purposes of understanding more details, I have repeated the slide that I already have shown to you. So now we will pick a subset of nodes from a given Porter value chain, and we will try to model the relation, or in this case of the software development function, the support department, and the product marketing group inside one organization. It basically means that the information flows, as we can see here on the slide, translate into service request channels, to use a Kanban term here that has been coined. For reasons of not making things too complex and easifying it for the presentation, I have grayed out for you the connections between the node technology and the node of strategy into the development. So we will actually drop them. We will only use the ones that still come in color. So we will model the relationship of the node from marketing and sales towards development. And we will include the node of the service and support function, also putting some input and information into the development function. Now, how to model that? First of all, if we have various service request channels, they basically provide input to a team, and they can be modeled in Kanban as different work item types or different work item formats. And actually, they are all competing for attention, and they are competing for resources. A team typically has a given capacity and a given capability that basically allows only a certain amount of work to be accepted at a given time, because capacity is limited. Capacity may come in different formats. Limitations may be that capacity is just in terms of man hours if humans are involved, or machine hours if it's machinery. That is a first level bottleneck. However, there can also be second level bottlenecks. With respect to people work, it could mean that there is a lack of skill. So if you are running into a situation where competing requests are actually asking for the same skill, you typically run into a capacity bottleneck. If they actually ask for different skills and you are lucky, then there is no bottleneck at all. However, sometimes the requests ask for a skill to be applied that is not present in a certain team. And then we need to figure out how to actually bring that skill to the team or group. Now, what I have modeled here for you on the lower section of the slide is actually that the marketing department which comes here in darkish red, and I have modeled that now in a better way of an optical and visual representation. The marketing team comes in dark red, and what the marketing team brings to the show is ideas that relate to net new feature requests. Net new features is going to be about new stuff. If the cool ideas that the marketing team has either collected in the market or has been making its mind up to themselves or so, and wants to now put them into kind of feature requests for the software development team to deliver. The second input channel here on the slide is the support team. Typically what the support team does is they provide input to the development function by reporting bugs of an existing product, or what we may refer to as so-called feature roundoffs. So there is an existing feature that the software team already has developed and successfully launched to the market, and it works without a bug. However, it needs enhancement in terms of the customer perspective onto this. So the customer actually requests an existing feature to be enriched. It's not a completely new thing. It's just like enriching something that already exists to make it more valuable. Now, both of those type of requests, they basically go into the software development team, and this asks potentially for prioritizing them out against each other. Modeling this now one step further in two more details, we can see that the basic design artifacts that the model and node relations according to service delivery principles we use fully are in sync with Kanban, because what we are going to use right here is one of the Kanban principles that is called manage the work and let people self-organize around it. So what you see in this representation is, as was announced on the teaser of this presentation, 3 out of 4 design elements that we typically use to basically derive a very simple model how to model the relationship between nodes. We use a matrix, that's the left part here, and the matrix shows backlog of future work that sometimes later somebody can pull on. Basically, the matrix codes stuff that is not worked on right now. It just sits there as a pipeline. The second part of the screen here shows in the middle a board that shows work in process, abbreviated as WIP, of current ongoing stuff. So that is the stuff that the team currently works on right now. And the right section of the slide shows a chart. Here, one of the representations, like a chart may look like, could be a so-called histogram of lead time distributions of stuff that already has finished. So the work items have passed through the board, and now we just model the metadata of their lead time as results that actually come along with the work procedures. What I have shown in the lower section of the slide for you is just the basic way how we actually implement that methodology in real life. It is just used by colorful post-its, which are commercially available. You may use different sizes of them. So here we have larger ones. Here to the right, for it is just about metadata and there is not so much content to move onto those, we can use smaller ones. And here in the middle, you just see a couple of colorful stickies that sometimes can be used to model out once stuff sits on the board, whether items are still on time or whether they actually are blocked. And you also can visualize about that. So the only remaining item that we have not covered on the first slide that we still want to have an idea on is the fourth design element, which we call table. So tables are actually used in this methodology for sizing and estimation. That means typically tables are only used temporarily, while the other 3 elements that we have seen before, namely the matrix, the board, and also the chart, have data on them sitting for a longer time. The tables are just used temporarily, very often within so-called refinement ceremonies, where the team actually starts to figure out, to understand better about the future upcoming work. What you see on the slide here with the two photos is two examples of a table that has been used in a workshop for estimating the complexity and the risk therein within certain population of future upcoming work tickets. So you see here just poker chips, which you can just acquire commercially available. And basically we have modeled out by a team a distribution of poker chips on the tickets. And this can be done in one or multiple dimensions. Very often, if we use a two-dimensional matrix approach, we use the dimensions of value versus risk, or we could use also importance versus urgency. Coming to the way how this may look like in practice, I have brought to this presentation also a representation of team's boardroom, how it looks after we have decorated the walls with all these design elements. What you can see here is on the very left hand of the side, we have the large granularity 4x4 matrices with high granularity backlog items. Then here in this section, you see that the matrix, if you count, is actually a 6x6, 6 fields in a row, 6 fields in a column. So a 6x6, that is 36 items on it max. And then here to the right, I have taken this out as a separate picture for you, we have sitting a board. Now, they are still very clean because I did the shoot of that photograph straight after we were actually finished with the wallpapering. Once they get populated, they really start to look very, very lively. And this gets then very interesting because then all the dynamics catch in. Now, the third and actually concluding session part should be about how do we model different work environments and contexts. Maybe some of you have already come across the situation that Kanban distinguishes between the delivery, the downstream part of it, and the discovery, the so-called upstream parts of Kanban. And I would like to show to you that also this matrix approach can be leveraging both in a quite similar fashion. So what you see on the slide here is that as well as the boards may look different from a discovery compared to a delivery Kanban, also matrices can come in different flavors depending on their respective context. To ease things up for us a bit, I will ask to actually increase the resolution of the screen for the last part. And basically, what we see here is that the left part of the slide shows a discovery Kanban bit that is consisting of 3 elements. On the very left on the slide, we have a triage matrix that shows a pool of ideas even before somebody invests the time to assess them. In the middle part of the slide, we see a discovery Kanban board that shows items that are currently assessed. So somebody is working on understanding them better and prepare them for later delivery downstream. And the third part, to the right on this slide, after the discovery board has been successfully passed, is a so-called ranking matrix that is consisting of a backlog of future work to pull from by the next team that is coming on the following node downstream. So you could assume that, for instance, this discovery Kanban setup as we see it on this slide could be a valid setup for a team space of a product marketing team. They have their pool of ideas to the very left. They have a discovery Kanban actually showing what they are currently working on, what ideas they elaborate. And to the right, they actually then have to decide together as a team or potentially running a product owner role that is doing the decisions as a single person on how to rank the different items that have been pre-processed to make sure that the highest value items go into the downstream funnels of the teams in the delivery functions first. So we want to maximize value and balance the value that we can get out of something that we do with the risk that it comes along with it. Having said that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I would like to open the call up now for questions.
Thank you, Boris. Great talk on inter-team and upstream Kanban. So I really appreciate it. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me. Hello.
All right, good. And then you mentioned toward the end that you want talking about the slide resolution. I just want to remind everyone that they have access to the PDF of your presentation, so they can look at it in detail, and those are available by going to the program information. So good. Let's see. So we got a question here saying culture follows values, practices follow culture. How and what do you do to implement it in portfolio Kanban? What do you have to say to that?
Do I implement what exactly in a portfolio environment? You mean the cultural aspect?
Yeah. How is culture influencing? How is the culture influencing? I guess the flow that you described.
Yeah. Okay. Now I get the question. Thanks. I mean, we can refer back to one of the slides where there were lots of these poker chips presented on one of the four design elements, the table. And this basically reminds me now when the question is asked that the whole thing is about a group exercise. It's a contact sport of people doing a workshop together, because the ranking exercise is actually a collaborative element. So the culture actually completely kicks in. And the anecdote that I may want to share with the audience here is as follows. When I conducted a workshop like this with some senior management representatives in the room, what we actually do when it comes to the poker exercises, we give out a number of chips that count to 100 points. And they come in the size of 1 or in the size of 5. And there's only like 4 or 5 times fivers. And we just send them over to the senior managers, and by intention, it is a number that doesn't actually split up. So there's like 3 managers of seniority level that we believe should have a vote, and we give them 5 chips. So they first of all have to figure out that they need to fight out, or they need to collaborate, or whatever. And this is already the first part where culture kicks in, because they have to sort them out amongst themselves. And then the second part is that if you give out 5 chips of 5 points each, that's summing up to 25, you have 75 chips of 0.1, and you hand them out to the whole group to say, okay, now it's up to the people to basically do a distribution function on all of the corresponding tickets. Rank them, first of all, in the first round by their value. And then in a second separate one, typically one before lunch, the second one after lunch, we repeat the whole exercise, but then the dimension that we want to assess is about risk. And now what happens is that some of the managers actually believe that they have the major leverage 5 times as much kind of a voting there, and put their dots on certain tickets. And interestingly, just some people in the group agree that they just pile up like 10 times 1 chip and put them onto another ticket, which actually leverages and buys out the vote of the management. And then the interesting bit gets on when you see how those people collaborate, because at the end of the day, this is not about actually fixing decisions. This is all about just creating inputs to what you may call a service request management function, if we're going to the Kanban role, or if some other agile terminology may resonate, like a product owner. And we actually, within the workshop, just provide a qualified, evidence-based, group-created feedback mechanism. At the end of the day, it's still about those responsible people in the role to vote what the final priorities are. And that is a very nice little way of actually figuring out about the culture of an organization. You actually really spot who of the people in the room have ever been collaborating before, because they just put their heads together and they just agree. And that can be an extremely fast procedure. And then you will see points of situations where people just enter into large debate. It could actually go as far as having some small little fighting there. There was evidence like this also. And then in most cases, after a couple of minutes, typically the sessions run about 15 to 30 minutes max, you can actually spot when the situation calms down and there's something like agreement. Sometimes it's about compromise. So you see people actually doing this kind of bargaining stuff and all this bazaar style behavior. Sometimes there is still open conflict where people tend to not agree and they just separate themselves into different corners of the room even, and so forth. And at the moment you spot that as a coach, it's very good to actually get an idea on where your potential future areas of work will be about, with whom to actually address, and what kind of conversation and so on. I hope this answers the question a bit.
No, that's great, very valuable. The next question in regards to decay of value. Did you bring into decay of value? Is urgency just considered constant, or how were you working with that?
Now, the idea of that mechanism is that on the very high level and early stages, it is just about value and risk. So basically, time doesn't play too much of a role there. Time starts to catch in when you need to express value in terms of a cost of delay function. That's the first time that time actually gets into the picture. Once we have done the discovery assessment, there is much more clarity about what an item is about and what the relationship between different items and their dependencies is likely to be about as well. And there you can actually, with a kind of informed decision, fairly assume that there has been enough learning to then actually really say something about time criticalness, and therefore create a sequence of different backlog items that you then want to move forward to one or even more corresponding teams who work on the stuff to create features and create value by them. So the time criticalness actually, from an operational perspective, only catches in after the discovery has. Before discovery, we don't take too much care about timing because the overall size of the chunks of work that we assess in discovery Kanban is very often much larger than the operational ticket size that we actually want to see on a delivery Kanban downstream anyway. So I like to actually borrow on the idea that David Anderson has shared with us already a couple of times, that we want to have two-level backlog when we enter into a full discovery followed by delivery downstream Kanban mechanisms. And this very often is actually a case in large-scale implementations. It basically always gets into this because you want to distribute work to much more teams in the delivery stage than you do within the discovery phase of such kind of activity. Hope this answers the question and is helpful.
Yep, very good, very good. There's another question about time, so I think it's good here, is how did your discovery matrices evolve over time? Were they relatively constant, or were you seeing changes to them?
So if people actually download the deck from the overall conference program, and I have already checked it out, it sits there and you can just click on it and download, and they go back to the slide rather at the end of the deck, they will spot that the left to the discovery board matrix actually features a 4-field center that is completely in black. So yes, there has of course been development on those matrices, and these recent developments actually date back to a phase of 2018 and 2019 when most of the discovery work actually was conducted. I introduced so-called anchors. So that's the central 4 fields of a 4x4 matrix, where out of the 4 anchor fields, you just place like 1 or 2 items that all of the people who are taking part in discovery triage sessions get an idea on how the complexity of already done stuff was with respect to the new upcoming stuff that they should assess now. So it's a like modeling, if you will. You do stuff that has been happening in the past where everybody has kind of common understanding, And relative to the old stuff, you assess the new items that are just flying in now. And this recent development actually acted as a kind of breakthrough. Before that, the discovery bit of the triage in front of discovery board always was sort of a pain in the ass, to be honest, if that is not too bold language. After we had modeled this kind of anchor fields out and actually tried that a couple of times and then refined it a bit, it was basically always like a straight pass. So that really, really helped. And the idea is actually that you do this triage thing in a product team daily Kanban stand-up. It is limited to max 15 minutes. And at the very beginning, nobody ever thought that we are going to make it, that something useful could drop out in terms of learning or information gain or so. And when we conducted that for a couple of days in a row, people started to get the idea and they really started to also like it. And this is where it became actually a self-driving vehicle. So that really was really one of the breakthrough moments of the whole methodology, I can say, in hindsight.
Well, great. Thanks. I think we've reached the end of our time. Really appreciate the talk and the question and answer period. So thank you so much, Boris.
Thanks for having me. And people can just drop me a note when they find all the contact data on the slide deck that they can download. Thank you very much.